places of the map so that you can actually use that mobility to your advantage. Whereas if you have a slow army, try to have all your bases as close to each other as possible. And one tip I'd like to give to this is, if you're not playing at the pro level, if you're not a diamond player, maybe you can just sneak an expansion in the middle of nowhere where your enemy probably won't scout that location. And you can actually get away in a lot of the games by doing this with an expansion. So maps also play a great part in terms of strategy. It's important to know not only the different strategies that you can execute per map, but also what your opponents can do as well. So the first map we're going to look at is Steps of War. This map is an example of a map with a very close rush distance. So rush strategies such as the 4-gate, 4-warp gate, all-in push, or even a bailing bus are very popular. So even if you're not a rush type of player, at least take note that your opponents could use these sort of rush strategies against you. So the second map I want to talk about is Scrapyard. So unlike the first map we looked at, this map actually has a long ground-to-ground rush distance. However, it's got a close air-to-air distance, meaning drop-based strategies or air attack unit-based strategies are really strong on this map. I don't know about, I'm sure you guys experience this as well, but when I'm playing on this map and I go for a very ground-heavy based army such as roaches, and when I have a sizable army, when I have like 20 roaches, I'm thinking to do a lot of damage to the opponent. So I leave my base, I'm traveling to the opponent's base, and what do you know? There's 5 Mutalisks coming into my base, kills all my drones, and the game's over even before I've even done anything to the opponent.
He's lying. That's never happened to him.
Happened to me.
So like, this sort of situation, we would like to call internally as a terrible, terrible damage situation. And just like in the battle reports, for some reason, whenever this happens to me, Dustin is always there, screaming terrible, terrible damage. Okay, so the third point is choke points. Everyone knows about the choke points that are in front of your base, and everyone knows how to utilize them well, too. But what a lot of people don't realize is there are choke points at different parts of the map as well. For example, on Blistering Sands right here, we notice that there's a choke point right in front of your natural expansion. There's a bunch of choke points in the center of the map, including the 2 choke points by the Zelnaga watchtowers. There's other choke points as well. For example, there's 2 choke points leading into the high-yield expansions. It's important to utilize these choke points when you're playing the game. For example, if you have a Marine and Marauder-based army versus your opponent is using speed-upgraded Zerglings, you really want to utilize these chokes. So when you're going for a push, try to stick to these chokes as much as possible, because if you fight at those chokes, you have the advantage, whereas if you fight in the open, the Zerg player has a huge advantage over you. So last thing is expansions. We talked briefly about when to expand and where to expand, but this varies drastically depending on what map you're playing. Lost Temple is an example of an easy-to-expand map. The choke point in front of your natural expansion is very small, and your future expansions can easily be defended by defending the 2 locations by the 2 ground-based paths by the Zelnaga watchtower. However, not all maps are like these, and it's important for you to watch replays, just try different things on different maps to figure out which expansion location works on which maps.
So I'm going to talk to you guys today about combat, and combat in Starcraft 2 is awesome. It's probably my favorite thing about Starcraft 2. And there's lots of little things you can do to improve your combat, and if your opponent is not doing these things, but you are, you can probably gain an edge over your opponent and win a lot of games. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is terrain. Now there's a couple key elements about terrain. There's choke points, there's high ground, and there's walls. Now the great thing is a lot of these elements can be found in and around your main start location. So you can use your minerals as a half wall, and usually your ramp leading out of your base can act as a choke and high ground. And all these things are great against melee units, units of short range, zealots, and you can, even if you have a very small army compared to your opponent, using the terrain properly can let you beat a much larger army. So here's a short video where we have Marines fighting against Zealots. And in this situation, the Terran player is not using terrain. You can see he has a wall behind him that if he backed up a little bit, he'd probably do a little bit better. But this is not a good fight for the Terran player. And we can see those Protoss Zealots just run over the Terran. Now in this video, the Terran player is using his choke. He's making the Protoss come to him. And you can see only 2 or even 3 Zealots at a time are able to get in on those Marines. And this is a really good fight for the Terran player. You can see that the Protoss player should have not fought in this spot. He should have probably backed up and looked for a more open spot. And along with terrain, we have flanking. Flanking is huge in combat. It's best used with swarms of small melee units like Zerglings, Banelings, and Zealots. But you can also make great use with flanking using burrowed units, especially a Roach who can actually move while burrowed. If your opponent's coming at you with Zealots, Stalkers, and a couple Colossus, and maybe his Colossus is trailing a little bit behind, if you can use flanking properly, you might be able to kill his Colossus before the rest of his army can even engage you. So let's look at a video of flanking. Now in this situation, we have Zerglings fighting Marines in the open, and this seems like a good fight for the Zerg player. He's fighting in the open, he's not using terrain, but the problem here is the scale. It's the size of the armies. Now because there's so many Marines and so many Zerglings, the Marines are actually creating their own terrain. Units in the back, the Marines in the back, the Marines in the middle, they're actually getting blocked by the Marines in front of them. And the Zerglings are taking a very long time to wrap around these Marines. And it's actually, even though it's in the open, it's not that great of a fight for the Zerg player.
This is one of the things that I think a lot of players don't really respect, or takes a lot of time for certain players to learn at least, is that the counters in StarCraft change depending on the size of the armies. A large Marine army is a different beast than a small Marine army, and you have to sort of watch that army size and use the terrain like this Zerg player failed to do to see what's going to happen in a particular battle.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this video, same number of Marines, same number of Zerglings. The only thing we've done is we split the Zerglings into 3 equal-sized groups. And you can see how fast the Zerglings are able to surround the Marines, and they're very effective in this spot. So in the last video, there was about 8 or 10 Marines remaining, and now we have about a dozen Zerglings left. So this is a pretty significant turn. There's also unit control. Now, a lot of people in the community will refer to this as micro or micromanagement. But the key thing here is it's just controlling your units and getting the maximum benefit from your units. And there's a couple of things to note here. It's best used in key battles, but you want to make sure not to overuse it. You don't want to over-micro. If you spend too much time controlling your units, you might get some small wins with your Marines. Maybe you end up saving a couple extra Marines, but meanwhile your opponent's spending his money, and he's sending more and more units at you, and before you know it, you got 2,000 minerals saved up, and your army's just too small to overcome his. So here's a video of 8 Stalkers fighting 8 Stalkers. Nothing fancy here. Both players are just letting their Stalkers fight. And we can see through small variations in how the units path or how the units focus fire each other that even though it's a 50-50 fight to begin with, it's not going to go exactly 50-50. We can see that Red's up a couple Stalkers. And looks like Red's going to have 2 Stalkers left over against the blue player. So in this situation, Red is using micro. He's using blink. He's using focus fire. He's moving his units. He's basically doing everything he can to win this fight. And Blue is just fighting normally. He's not doing anything special. And we can see that Red is up way ahead right now. Red hasn't lost a single Stalker yet. And if this was a real game situation, he's got